Nellie Bly, originally named Elizabeth Jane Cochrane, was born May 5, 1864 in Pennsylvania. She was a very smart young child and always wore pink dresses, which is where she received the nickname Pinky. She loved to play, especially with her older brothers, Albert Paul Cochrane, Harry Cummings Cochrane, Charles Cochrane, and William Worth Cochrane. When she was 6 years old, her family experienced the unfortunate tragedy of her father's passing. She had to try to find jobs to support her family, but as a woman, it was difficult to find jobs. She decided on going to Indiana Teachers College, but her family eventually ran out of money and she had to drop out. A few years later, she decided to add an E to her name, changing her name from Cochran to Cochrane. Later on, she testified strongly with her mother against her stepfather in the case of abuse. She ended up helping her mother run a boarding house for several years. Her news career was finally kicked off when she wrote a complaint letter to the Pittsburgh Dispatch. They had wrote a hate article against women titled, "What Are Women Good For?" She wrote a complaint letter, and through this complaint letter, they were impressed, so they offered her a job. She accepted and then took up her pen name Nellie Bly. She received her pen name through a song by Stephen Foster. One of her first popular works was her book, 6 Months in Mexico, where she went to Mexico for 6 months and traveled through experiencing the horrors of the Mexican culture. After she published her books, she later angered the Mexican government and had to be chased out violently for fear of execution. One quote from her book talks about the life of married women in Mexico, saying, "The marriage festivities are often kept up for a week. After that, a husband claims his bride, and right jealously does he guard her. Her life is spent in seclusion, eating, drinking, sleeping, and smoking. The husband is desperately jealous, and the wife is never allowed to be in the company of another man. Life to a Mexican lady in an American's view is not worth living." She was working at the Pittsburgh Dispatch and was working to prove women worthy of the jobs. She wanted to do an expose on the prisons, but the editor, John Pulitzer, challenged her to go do the asylum job instead. So, at the age of 23, she left for a boarding house to prove herself insane. She set out to find a fake identity and a boarding house to stay at. She was going to play a mentally ill Cuban immigrant who had been robbed from. She pretended to be mentally ill in the mirror and wandered the halls and streets, screaming and yelling at all hours of the day. Within days, the boarding house had called the police and Bly was arrested. After a court trial, a confused judge decided to send her to Blackwell's Island. Blackwell's Island was only built for a capacity of 1,000 people, but when she arrived, she had seen 1,600 crammed inside. She was only awaiting the horrors that would come to her. Only 16 doctors were on staff. They were poorly trained and had little compassion. Asylums were often used as thrills or entertainments. Many patients revealed the abuse and horrors there. Patients had to take ice baths and often were not fed. Often serious illness and rotten food and sour meat and dirty water were given, and which caused many inmates to be sick. Very often the water was almost brown. She later found out that some of the inmates weren't even ill. They had went there looking for a poorhouse, but had actually just been thrown in the asylum. Many had even been looking for the regular hospital and had just been tossed aside. Many of her works were published within days of leaving the asylum and later put into a collection of books. 2 or 3 months after she left the asylum, a jury visited and found that they had gotten cleaned up and better food and cleaned the whole place from her accusations. She got a bill passed for more mental health funding, and over $1 million were sent over to the asylums, which would equal about $24 million now. Later, after the asylum, she set out to beat the Jules Verne Around the World in 80 Days record by going in 72 days. A rival newspaper had also sent out a reporter to try and beat Nellie Bly's record. Elizabeth Bisland arrived 4 days later than Nellie Bly. Later on in Nellie Bly's life, she married Robert Seaman, a wealthy businessman, who later died and left his business, Ironclad Manufacturing, to Nellie Bly. She had taken a break from writing, but later returned to writing as a foreign correspondent agent in World War I and did this until her death. Her exposés turned into books, plays, and Broadway musicals. She rode in the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., helping women gain rights. On Blackwell's Island, there still stands a head statue of Nellie Bly, representing all the amazing things and changes Nellie Bly made in our world.